As we've been focusing on the Middle East, you've probably figured out by now that the Middle East is a tumultuous area. It has been, dating back probably about, I don't know, a couple thousand years. But we're going to look at things more recently, or at least recent in the scheme of World War II. World War II, of course, you know what had happened to millions of Jews living throughout Europe. And following the war, the State of Israel was created as a safe place for Jews to go. This took place in and around 1948, so the State of Israel, where it sits now, was created. From the moment that Israel breathed its first breath, it was at war with its neighbors. Its neighbors resented the fact that, number one, Israel had been created out of land that some thought that they owned. Secondly, they resented the fact that the Muslim Middle East was now going to include a Jewish homeland. So from the very moment that Israel was created, its neighbors all declared war against it. They refused to recognize the existence of Israel. They refused to admit that Israel had, or should have, a right to exist. All of these countries of the Middle East swore an oath that they would work for the absolute destruction of Israel. And as a result of the previous claims, there was a constant state of war starting in 1948, and then it would sometimes go cold, and then in 1967 and in 1973. 1967 and 1973, the Arab countries ganged up, attacked Israel again, and once again, little Israel was able to defeat them. Now, keep in mind, Israel had a state of the art military, in part because it was receiving funds from both the United States, England, as well as a few countries in Western Europe. So Israel was able to strengthen itself even though it was attacked numerous times. And when you consider the countries of the Middle East, there was a leader, and their leader was Egypt. Egypt was, at that time, the wealthiest, the most respected, and many people believe the most powerful of all of the Arab nations. So, what Egypt did, so too did most of the other countries of the Middle East. This was going to be the key. If you look at these three maps, they illustrate the growth of the Israeli state. As you see from 1947, that's the original country given to Israel. You can see that after attacks from 1947 to 1967, as well as in 1967, Israel is able to grow. In particular, the territory that sits between Israel and Egypt, known as the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula sits between the Gulf of Suez to its west and the Gulf of Aqaba to its east. This area had once been Egyptian land, but following their failed attempt to conquer Israel in 1967, Israel took this land. They used it as a buffer. They needed it to protect themselves, or so they said, from the Egyptians attacking again. So, Jimmy Carter, the President of the United States, was a great humanitarian. He recognized that the Middle East was an area in turmoil. He cared deeply about peace and wanted to work hard to get it. He had also seen that there had been a number of terrorist attacks throughout the 1970s, many directed by the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Their goal was to get their own homeland. The PLO was supported in part by Egypt, who, again, as I said, was the most powerful country of the Arab nations within the Middle East. So President Carter began to form a relationship with the leader of Egypt, a man named Anwar Sadat. Sadat was an ex-military man. He had risen to power and was a relatively popular leader, but he recognized that his country had many issues. And he believed, Sadat is, that if he formed a better relationship with the United States, that it could help solve many of his country's problems. On the other side was a man named Menachem Begin. Begin had been the veteran of many wars since his country had been founded. He certainly believed that it was absolutely imperative for the Israelis to protect himself, but he also had come to feel that it was going to be impossible for Israel to survive long term if they were always at war. He knew that at some point he needed to make peace. He didn't think peace would be easy because he didn't actually think that any Arab nation would be willing to make a peaceful settlement with he and his country. Then you have old Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, and as I said previously, Carter was deeply interested in bringing both the Arabs, in this case Egypt, and the Israelis to the table to see, was there any common ground? Could they work something out? And after meeting individually with both men and countries and a lot of behind the scenes work, Jimmy Carter was able to convince both the Egyptian leader and the Israeli leader to come together to negotiate. Keep in mind how difficult this was. The Arabs, the Egyptians, hated Israel, didn't believe it had the right to exist, and the Israelis were deeply suspicious of anything the Egyptians were going to do. So the first miracle was that he actually convinced both sides to meet in Maryland at the luxurious Camp David retreat, and there the goal was to meet. Well, the first problem was Sadat and Begin only agreed to meet face to face once. The conversation was very short and somewhat hostile. So from that point on, the only way anything could get done was Jimmy Carter serving as the middleman. He would speak to Sadat. Sadat would share with him his concerns. Carter would take those concerns to the Israeli leader Begin, who would respond, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth they would go. There were really two key issues that hung up the meetings. The first is, would Israel be willing to return the Sinai Peninsula? As you recall, the Israelis had taken the Sinai after being attacked in the 1967 war, and many Israelis said that possessing this territory was absolutely vital to their survival, that they needed it for protection. The Egyptians, on the other case, realized that the Sinai was loaded with oil, as well as was a great vacation spot, so they wanted it back. Number two, would Egypt agree to peace with Israel? No other country in the Middle East had recognized Israel's right to exist. All of the other countries in the Middle East said that they wanted to destroy Israel. Would Egypt be willing to take that brave first step? Well, after lots of back and forth meeting, they came to a historic agreement. And here's what it said. Egypt was the first country to officially recognize Israel as a nation. Officially, the two sides ended the state of war, and keep in mind this is 1979, the state of war that had existed since Israel's creation in 1948. Additionally, Israel agreed that they would hand back the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians. And all of these things paved the way for future peace talks. So again, Egypt says that Israel has a right to exist. The state of war ends. The Sinai Peninsula goes back to the Egyptians, and they set a date for future peace talks. So what did each side gain? Israel gained peace with its largest and most powerful enemy. Keep in mind that Egypt was the ringleader in the Middle East. Now, Israel could guarantee, or at least assume, that they would not be attacked again from Egypt. Secondly, many people viewed the Israelis as too tough, unwilling to deal, unwilling to negotiate. Well, this showed that they would be able to come to a compromise if somebody was willing to compromise with them. Egypt, what did they get? They got peace with a powerful neighbor. But more importantly, keep in mind I had said that Sadat had recognized that his country had problems, economic problems. What he got was a guarantee of money from the United States. To this very day, Egypt and Israel are two countries that get among the most foreign aid from the United States. So, in exchange for making this deal with the Israelis, Egypt got money, they got military support, and this would help bolster the power of the country. And what did the US get? We got international prestige for helping to bring at least some small degree of peace to a struggling region. And old President Jimmy Carter, who failed at many other things, was able to earn a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. So, while the agreement did not fully fix all the problems of the Middle East, at least it went a step towards making things more peaceful, and it set about a peaceful course between the country of Egypt and Israel, which exists to this very day.